Is DC's move back to Wednesdays hurting comics? That is what Bleeding Cool put up an article about this week, with the suggestion that maybe DC's decision to go from Tuesdays to Wednesdays actually wasn't a good thing. So here's the argument. This is an article by Rod Lamberti, who is a comic book shop owner that was allowed to do an article for Bleeding Cool. And I thought it was fascinating. So I'm going to read just a little bit of it, and then, we'll take it in. So he says, in July, DC started moving their new comics on sale dates from Tuesdays to Wednesdays. It was a foolish thing to do for me as a comic book retailer, and DC's sales dropped because of it. Sales dropped because people were no longer coming in on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. What is one of the many things a comic store should do? Get people to come into their store. The more people that come in, the more chances of them spending money. When I go to Target because I need soap and then come back the next day because I need toothpaste, people at Target don't question why I have to come back. They are a big business. Target wants people to come in as many times as possible. The second time I went, I saw something else and decided to buy it, along with the item I went to Target for. Or I even buy more than one item, like a bunch of Magic the Gathering packs. That's more sales for Target. Multiply that by thousands of people who do that at Target, and that adds up. I had people coming in upset that DC was no longer being sold on Tuesdays. I told people this for a month, though many were still in the habit of coming in on Tuesdays for new comics. I had one person who I had seen once in a blue moon pick up previously released comics and then ask where the new DC titles were. Then I told him I could no longer sell DCs on Tuesdays. He put the titles he could have bought back on the shelf. I told him those I could sell to him with no problem because they were previous releases. He just left. So it's a great article. I think everybody should read it, but I gave you the gist of his point, which is that DC wanting to align more with where the comics industry is actually damaged sales for comic book retailers whose audiences have been conditioned for the last 4 years by DC that Tuesdays is DC Day. Do you guys agree with Rod's perspective?
For me, I read digital, so I have a little less stake in this game. um, in fact, Tuesday was beneficial to me because if I'm reading for the show on Thursdays, DC could be my day to catch up, so I'm not reading a whole chunk Wednesday night or Thursday, during my lunch break. So doesn't really matter to me. But I would rather just go once a week if it's I'm putting my mindset back into when I was buying physical copies. I don't want to have to go twice a week. And then if I go on Wednesday, and now the chance of me getting the DC books that or variants or whatever that I wanted on Tuesday is less, that means less DC books for me. So if I could do one stop shopping, even if I'm going to Target, I'd rather do one stop shopping. I don't want to have to go back. If I came back, it's because I screwed up. Um, so I don't see how this tracks, in my opinion.
I think it's just you have the opportunity for more traction, and I think that's the thing. Like just from like thinking from a retail perspective, I think ensuring that you have multiple reasons for people to come back to a store is more advantageous because you can build a habit around 2 days versus the one day. I think you will have the people who want to come in a single day, Wednesday, maybe they miss out on a book. That's not, that bad. But to have people and have the opportunity to come in back to back because they want to, especially if they're in it week to week, they are the Wednesday, Tuesday warrior. I whenever I go pick up a a comic in physical, last one was a couple weeks ago, but I end up picking up random stuff off the shelves too because I'm like, oh, I'm here for this comics. Oh, that's right, I forgot that volume 2 of my favorite thing is monsters came out. I dropped $50 on that, right? Because it was there. I had the opportunity to come in. If I were to come in the next Tuesday, the following, or that Wednesday right after that Tuesday, I would have bumped into something else because I know myself and I know that that's the habit of me entering a store. And I think retailers can take advantage of that, not in a malicious way, obviously, but they could push more books in more frequency, even though you have people who maybe only come in on either day and they risk the chance of missing out on a book because at the end of the day, you're in a comic book store and you have the opportunity to buy and purchase.
And that's the thing that makes the most sense to me. The more excuses to get people into a comic book store, the better the comic book stores are going to do. And we we all predicted doom when this first happened, during COVID. Um Admittedly, we couldn't see past COVID. And now that COVID is past, quote unquote, your mileage may vary on that statement. But now that we're back to normal, quote unquote, your mileage may vary. The, you know, it's worked. It's got, we're not seeing so many comic shop closures. There is more money being spent in comic book shops.
Has it worked if they're changing it though?
Well, my argument would be, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not, I can't say I'm privy to it. Flo Dameron just gave us a 5 spot. And he said retailers complained when they moved to Tuesday. It's literally why they went back to Wednesday. And I don't know if I get that, or I don't know if I'm with that statement. But what it does read to me, the whole situation, is it's sort of another broader Warner Brothers DC positioning of like, they just don't care about the retailers.
Rob, I would love to hear from you on, so A, the question at hand, do you think that DC's hurting stores by moving back to Wednesdays? But also B, are you a physical man or a digital man?
I'm a digital guy. Like I'm gonna voice a very unpopular opinion here in certain circles. Um, I think comic book stores are archaic. I think comic book stores are reminiscent of a bygone age, right? Like this is not the days of Phil Seuling, when he pitches the idea of the direct market to um, Jim Shooter, and to oh my God, what's his name? The guy that took over as editor in chief after Stan Lee. I can't remember his name. But anyway, it's not the 70s anymore, right? Like there was a time where comic book stores had their era, right? Between the Overstreet Price Guide in 71 going up to the collapse of, or near collapse of the comic book industry in the 1990s. Like, yeah, that was the era of comic book stores. But like it's the digital age, right? And as a guy who used to travel to Comic Cons with 20 floppies in my backpack, reading through them on a plane, life became a lot easier when I would just download the Comixology app back in the day and just read them on an iPad. Right. And
I feel
so
that. I feel
if a lot of these complaints about, well, it's hurting business and all that kind of stuff are coming from comic book stores like the one down the road, right, in Fort Collins, that is a comic book store that does nothing but comics. They've still got Venom Lethal Protector from David Michelini back in the 1990s, right, just splashed on the front, and it's all washed out because it's been there for 30 years at this point. I don't know what to tell you. Sorry about your luck, right? Like, learn to adapt to the market, because you guys I mean, it's a fantastic point to say, if what I need is to go get stuff for my house, am I going to go to a specialty soap store and a specialty shampoo store and a specialty paper towel store? Or am I going to go to Target and buy it all in one place and then leave? And that's exactly what people are going to do. Right. And so unless you're a store that's able to sit down and say, okay, so sure, like we sell comics, but we also sell manga, and we have like tabletop spaces for people who want to do Magic the Gathering or play Star Wars tabletop or any number of those tabletop games that are out there. They're going to succeed while others are not. But for comics themselves, it's time to move away from this era of selling physical copies, and it's time to move into like the digital age and actually put some umph into it. Not launch Marvel Unlimited, then make people wait 6 months to buy new comics. I mean, like, actually put some energy into it, and I think they'd actually find a lot more success. But to your point, is DC switching to Wednesdays hurting business? Maybe, maybe not. I think that guy in that instance is cherry picking, right? When he says, like, he's like, it's killing our businesses. Why? a dude came in here on Tuesday and just decided that like he wasn't going to buy any comics because new DC comics weren't out that day and just chose not to come back the next day. Okay, well that's like one guy. That's like a guy, right?
And also, was he busy the next day? Like, will he
Yeah.
come back next week and get those same comics? Like,
I mean, I've been part of the comic book scene, industry, whatever, for almost 30 years at this point. You guys have been reading comics for a lengthy amount of time. We've all been in comic book stores. You know the kind of people that frequent comic book stores. Number one, you don't usually hang out and talk to them. You just go there, get your comics, and leave. And number two, like there are some special kinds of special people that go to those comic book stores. And this dude may have just been one of them, right? The guy that like goes to a movie theater that's totally empty and has an assigned seat and it's in the crappiest part of the theater and sits in that seat because that's the seat that he was given. And the idea of like sitting anywhere he wants to just doesn't cross his mind, right? Like folks that just kind of live in this sort of rigid path, and to use an example of just a guy that represents the point that you're trying to make, as opposed to building your point around what's actually happening is totally different. But again, I don't have access to like all the behind the scenes information. I don't work for Diamond or any of those companies, and so I can't tell you with any measure of certainty if like DC moving to Tuesdays was costing comic book stores 30, 40, 50% of the business that they were getting beforehand. Like I can't say with any real measure of certainty if that's the case. Now, if it turns out to be that that is right, that like there was an actual decline in sales for comic book stores with DC Comics when they moved to Tuesdays, then you'll get no argument from me there in terms of them saying like DC needs to go back to Wednesdays. Like if there's an issue, I don't know. I mean, there is a point to be made here about saying that like the fan base has been conditioned to buy comics from DC on Tuesdays. Okay, cool. So like just buy them on Wednesdays now. Problem solved. Like it's not rocket science. It didn't make them inaccessible, right? Just wait 24 hours and then go to the store and buy them. Like I don't know.
One of the,
I don't really know.
one of the things I like to do, especially with Bleeding Cool articles, is read the Facebook comments to them when they share the post, because that's where I see like, oh, I own a comic book shop. Oh, I own a comic book shop. It's like that generation is there. I see, and most of the comments for this one were like, nah, it's better. This one day I have to plan for, So this does feel anecdotal. Like I don't want to discredit this guy's opinion or his what he's seeing, but it does feel very anecdotal and maybe not pervasive of everyone's opinion on what's going on here.
Yeah.
So I do want to say that first of all, I definitely didn't read the whole article, and I think it is quite good. He does make a lot of other points that are really salient about the relationship with lunar distribution as different from diamond and how some of those things make it easier. So he talks about how when it was diamond, and DC books were being shipped out through diamond, they would get the books on Tuesday to be put on display by Wednesday. That's always been the way it's worked in comics, or at least for the last, 20 years through Diamond, where it was really tough to get your books with ample time to prepare your shop to put them out. But with Lunar and the way that they've done things, and Penguin Random House and some of these other distributors that have entered the space, that is not true anymore. Nowadays, you do get your comics with a little bit more lead time. So the point he was making with that was we have the time to set up our stores for 2 launch days. So it's not the same industry in that regard anymore. So we don't actually need to make this change back to Wednesdays because it's not a big deal for us anymore. The problem that I have with this argument is that that's only one point of the problem with having multiple distributors on multiple days. The other side of that coin is all of the busy work that goes into having to deal with multiple distributors who have different systems that you, the retailer, have to learn in order to purchase your books and do all of the back end stuff that's required for a comic book shop to function. And those things are easier under one distributor with one day. We're never going back to the days of one distributor. So that's out the window. So how can you make it a little bit easier? By having one day. I'm selfish. I want physical books, and I want them on Wednesday. There wasn't one single Tuesday across 4 years that I went to my LCS, which is Midtown Comics, ever. I wouldn't do it. I'll never do it. I will only go on Wednesday, or if it all shifts to another day, I'll go that day. But Wednesday's the day. Any other day might as well not exist. There might as well not be a comic book shop. I'm going one day.
Even when you screw up and you maybe get the wrong issue or forget an issue, that's next week's problem.
Yep.
Yeah. Just add it to the pull list.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's right. Yeah.
I mean, there was something kind of nice about reading on Tuesday, then being able to get a break, and then read on Wednesday. But it's not like a deal breaker.
yeah.
That's
no
where I am.
means.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good pacing for your own reading habits. You know, digest a bit more. I felt like can enjoy the books a bit more because it's not a rush to finish through a slew of your list. You know.
You're taking sips throughout the week as opposed to just chugging on Wednesday.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
I
especially
wanna-
if you're
go
running a YouTube comic book channel and you got to review this kind of stuff, right? If it's just like, okay, so we got Wednesday, guys, we got to read it all, right? But I don't know though, man, because I'm going to ask you guys a serious question, right? So DC just launched Absolute Power.
Mhm.
Before that, what was there to read? You have Batman, World's Finest. Superman from Philip Kennedy Johnson was really, really good.
Yep.
You got Jason Aaron's Action Comics now, but it basically just started, right? We're what, like 6, maybe 7 issues into it so far?
He's already off it.
He's already off of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
did a 3-issue arc, and then
Yep.
Joshua Williamson took it over again, and now Gail's on it. And then when she leaves, Josh will be back again.
Oh, see, I know he did like I Bizarro. Like I know that was like his
Yeah.
inaugural run.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I thought Williamson took over temporarily while Jason Aaron was doing whatever. And wow, yeah, that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Well-
I actually just started following Gail Simone on Twitter
Good
Oh
follow.
yeah.
Good Facebook
Oh,
follow. If you could follow
like
her
a
on
week and a
Facebook,
half
yeah.
ago. Yeah. So like I have not kept up on the fact that I wouldn't know until like I went to go crack it open and it's just like from Gail Simone. So I wonder why Jason Aaron left.
So, without having actual like intimate behind the scenes knowledge, what I surmise happened is that they were interested in getting PKJ off the book because they wanted to do the All Stars thing, not have Joshua Williamson have to write every single arc because he's overworked. And so they went to people like Jason Aaron and Gail Simone, whose schedules are really packed. Both of them are mercenaries right now. They're working for all kinds of publishers, so they really can't commit to too many long form things. And I think being able to have 3-issue arcs that fit in the margins of the story that Joshua Williamson is telling was the point.
Huh. That's interesting. Kind of a mortar between the bricks. Okay.
Yeah.
Could
But
see that.
I also see this with like Absolute Power and the shift that DC's doing with All In and Absolute coming up as tying into this Wednesday shift. It seems to be that they're going like this. This seems like a shift to be beneficial towards the retailer. Like they talked about all the physical stuff and the promotion that'll be around All In Absolute. I think they even mentioned like potential, like they've done like Green Lantern rings and all that stuff. So they're going to be pushing marketing to shops as well. So this felt like, hey, this is a step that we're seeding a little bit before October to get ready for this big event that we can kind of control the shops around our messaging.
Yeah, and by the way, I spoke improperly. It is Wade after Simone, and that's getting into the all-in
Sure.
era. So
Josh
yeah.
is on Superman. Yeah.
Yep.
It's gonna be interesting, man.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the last point I wanted to make on the subject of the LCS, I really want to leave it to Atomic Hound, who I thought made a great point. So, Rudale in the comments section said "adapt or die," in reference to the idea that the comics industry needs to move forward. And Atomic Hound responded to that with, "But you don't adapt to die." And that is always the point that I come back to, which is that, I think pretty much everybody would say that there are something wrong with the comic book industry, and we can all pick one thing that we think is the most wrong. But I think if any solution completely annihilates the LCS or doesn't have them in consideration, then the solution has to consider that the industry will die and thus has to radically change. And I believe that too many people will be left out of the equation to have the industry be as viable as it is. And we all know where that viability is in question. So I think it's a very large risk to completely eschew the LCS.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Okay.
I don't know if I agree with that statement. And again, the reason why I say that is if you look across the if you look at the board in general, print media as a medium is struggling universally, right? Newspapers, magazines, the whole 9 yards. Why? Because everybody reads things digitally now. Because everybody has iPhones, Androids, tablets, different things like that. I think the biggest issue with the comic book industry right now is that the comic book industry is trying to get the world to adapt to them as opposed to the comic book industry adapting to the world. And you have to adapt to your market, your changing market, right? It's not the market's job to adapt to you, right? It would be like if Pepsi released, and this is a terrible analogy. It would be like if Pepsi released a new product and just didn't market it. It's like, well, I mean, we're Pepsi, of course they're gonna buy it. It's like, no, not really. I mean, if this again, like millennials, people like that are my age, boomers, older than me, grew up in an era where you go to a physical comic book store and you buy a comic book and then you bring it back. But you have Gen Z kids, Gen Alpha kids, right, who were born in an age where everything is done on their phone. The concept of going into a comic book store to buy a comic book just is probably foreign to them. Sure, it exists, but like there's a reason why bookstores struggle and why they're considered boutique shops, and why I would argue that comic book stores are boutique shops. So the reality here is I understand the idea that the comic book market, the direct store is like a physical thing. It exists out there and it's been there for a long time. And that's all well and good. But I think the reality here is that for longevity, at least just in the sales of comics, moving away from catering exclusively to comic book stores by putting these kind of blockades on new comics, like 6-month windows, and saying, well, if you want to read what's going on right now, you need to go to a comic book store and buy it. And instead saying, like, if you want to know what's going on with Batman right now, you can read it online or you can go to comic book stores. That's the way to go. Now, does that mean that it could lead to the decline or the death of a comic book store? Sure. But the reality here is I don't really look at comic book stores as a necessity for the success of comic books as a medium. I look at comic book stores in a lot of ways as just laboring beasts, gasping for breath, right? Reminiscent of a bygone age. That's how I see it. Now again, not everybody sees it. That's why I say that's a very unpopular opinion, right? And you'll find people on both sides. Some folks will be like, Rob doesn't care anything about comic books, and yada yada yada. And there will be people who are like, Rob wants, comic book, comic book stores to die and that kind of a thing, and people can cherry pick, the points that I'm making. But the fact is that like we're in 2024, the age of artificial intelligence, the age of digital information. There's no reason why we should still have the comic book industry using an analog business model in a digital age. I just don't see. I just don't see how that works. I mean, collectibles, sure, right? I've got X-Men #1, and I've got all 4 variant covers of X-Men Volume 2, issue #1. And I've got physical copies of the first appearance, or the physical copy of the first appearance of Reverse Flash that I had Joshua Williamson sign. And I've got X Force #1, and I've got New Mutant, or what is it, Marvel graphic novel with the first appearance of New Mutants, and so on. I have physical copies of comic books, but I have maybe like 14 in my house. Everything else is digital. So yeah, that's why I say like I get the value of comic book stores. I get that there are people who are always going to want to see them there. But I think that as a company, it's your job to keep yourself afloat and to pursue lines of thought in the business world that does that. And I think that focusing on the idea of comic book stores and propping them up artificially is actually doing DC and Marvel more harm than good.
So I have
So
two responses to that. So the first one is that it is absolutely possible to get day and date digital comics. So there is no barrier to that. The barrier exists on the Marvel and DC apps, but
yes.
not in the marketplace. So anyone can get, I mean, our guys here read digitally, so they get their books digitally every week for us to review them on Pals Pulls at 6 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays.
Yeah.
And so you can get them if you want them digitally. You, of course, Rob, are a digital reader yourself. But then on top of that fact, we know that manga readers exist who read physically. There are plenty of people that buy them. They sell out like hotcakes. We also know that there are plenty of kids that are reading Dogman and Raina Telgemeier books and Scholastic books and etc. So there is a market for physical reading, but there is something that is keeping from people physically reading or reading in general comics, because we also know that the digital sales of comics, the last time we had real sales figures coming from the entire industry, we knew that digital comic sales were less than 10% of the entire medium's comic sales. That is a terrible number. And I think what it reflects is that the market for comic books in the direct market, in the industry, has spoken. And the market that exists wants to get their books physically. What you're talking about is creating another market that doesn't yet exist. And that is a massive gamble that could burn the whole industry down. Yes, something could rise out of those ashes, but that something won't be what we have now, and it might not actually be sustainable. Granted, we'll never know until we do it, but I would argue that the numbers don't favor that choice.
Oh, I mean, if you're talking about like the performance of comic books as a medium these days, I mean, yeah, sure. Like, here's a really good example. Okay, Sean, I want to read Spider-Man. Where do I start?
You start with what is currently happening in Spider-Man. You just pick up an issue and go.
Okay, but like, here's the issue though. So like they talk about the events of Doctor Octopus taking over the body of Spider-Man. So, I mean, how do I get into that? Or
So
they talk about Parker Industries. Like, how do I get into that?
I'll answer this with my own life experience. When I started reading comic books, it was 2005, 2004ish, somewhere in there. I started with New Avengers, Amazing Spider-Man number whatever, and Ultimate Spider-Man number whatever. I had no context for absolutely anything that was happening outside of just having seen Spider-Man in other media and whatever characters were in the books in other media. I didn't know a thing about how they were in comics. And nearly 20 years later, I'm here.
Okay, cool. So let's add the complexity of people wanting instant information now.
Wikipedia. Or your channel.
Yeah,
Your channel. You
well,
have
that's why my channel is successful,
right.
because like I've literally been to cons and people are like, I want to get into Spider-Man, but I don't know where to start. And it's like, okay, what are you interested in? Right? You have to literally sit people down. And it's almost like a job interview, right? Like where it's like, okay, so what are you interested in Spider-Man? Like, what is it about Spider-Man that you like? Well, I love Spider-Man comics that are really fun and like he teams up and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So read the comic right now with Spider-Man and Miles Morales teaming up, right? Like that works. But if somebody sits down and is like, I want to understand what's going on with Spider-Man right now, say like all new, all different Marvel when they pitch that. Okay, cool. So like they want to like just pick up all new, all different Spider-Man number one. Okay, well, Spider-Man's running Parker Industries. Like, when in the world did he create Parker Industries? Well, technically he didn't. Dr. Octopus did that during Superior Spider-Man. So you got to go read Superior Spider-Man. But in order to understand Superior Spider-Man, you got to read Dan Slott's Spider-Man and you got to read Dying Wish. But in order to understand how you get to Dying Wish, you got to start with Spider-Man Big Time. But in order to understand things in Spider-Verse, you got to go read J. Michael Straczynski's run, where you're introduced to the other and things like that. And and that's one of the things I don't like when people compare like comics to manga, right? Because when you take something like manga, it's just a dude writing a story, and when he's done, and like that's it. There's no spin-offs really, right? Like you don't have like Dragon Ball Z and then Web of Dragon Ball Z and Superior Dragon Ball Z and all new, all different Dragon Ball Z, right? You just have like Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super, and GT if you choose to watch that show, right? Not really a Kira Toriyama project, but you know, still, like it's self-contained. It runs for a period of time and it's done. Now that period of time might be 5 years, it could be 30 years if you're talking about something like Berserk. But the fact is, it's self-contained, and when it's done, it's done. When it comes to like comic books, it's just always it's just a continuous story that goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, and each individual story is relative to the person who's writing it, right? It's just dependent on the person who's writing it, and some elements of those story matter and some elements of those stories don't, right? Like Scott Snyder comes along. Scott Snyder's Batman run is lauded as being like the greatest Batman run ever. He did two things in that story. He introduced the Court of Owls and he brought back the Joker, and that's it. That's all he did over the course of the entirety of his new 52 Batman run. Now, the storytelling was phenomenal, but what happened to the Court of Owls? Well, then it turns out there's some international organization and then just faded into obscurity when he left Batman. And that was it. Now, like you see them occasionally on like some monitor somewhere or something along those lines, right? But the reality here is that comic books are so intertwining and stories are so complex and narratives just go back and forth. And sometimes they matter and sometimes they don't. That it's almost impossible for the average person to know how to start with a comic book, right? How to start with a comic book character or a comic book team. It makes things insane. Like comic books, I think the biggest reason why comic books struggle in this day and age is because they're just inaccessible to the average person,
I
right?
think, yeah.
This is
Yeah,
why
it's just
things like Ultimate Comics were made. This is probably why things like Absolute Comics are being made right now.
I mean, sure, but
Yeah.
like I have people in the comments section of my Ultimate Black Panther video or my Ultimate Spider-Man video.
Sure.
So how does this tie into like Zeb Wells' run? How does this tie into what's going on right now? It's like, well, it doesn't. It's a whole different thing. And like you have to explain that to them.
Think,
You're I'm sorry, I just want to make this
please.
just say this last thing. You're right, but digital comics won't change that. You will still have that same problem, and they're gonna change the way that you pay for books so that you don't have the ability to just run through and consume everything for a low price. If someone says to you, hey, Comics Explained, I love your channel, where should I start with Spider-Man? Whatever answer you give them, they're going to have to go and get that book, whether it's digital or physical. The method doesn't matter. The complexity of comics will not go away because we swap from physical to digital. That's a completely separate issue.
No, I don't think that's true at all. Because I literally have playlists on my channel that's like new to the X-Men, start here. Right. And
Yeah,
like that's just where that's where you pick up.
but they
Like,
still have to go get that book, whether it's physical or digital.
oh, sure. But like digital gives you the ability to organize and catalog books in a way that physical just can't do. Right. For a
But
variety of reasons.
so does a notepad and pen.
Sure. But I mean, like, am I okay? I mean, let's be honest here, right? Like, am I going to sit down and say, okay, I want to read Spider Man? Well, let me break out my legal pad and my ballpoint pen and let me write down the order of the comics. People aren't going to do that because what you're talking about here, for example, are people who like if what Marvel and DC is actually trying to do, they're trying to tap into the audience of people who go see like comic book movies, things like that. But they're also trying to get people who have never read comics before into comic books. Up until Iron Man 1, in 2006, when that movie was made and it was marketed, Marvel had to convince people that Iron Man was not a robot. People thought
Totally.
Iron Man was a robot, that he was a machine. They didn't know he was a person in a metal suit. Like there were people out there who didn't know that Steve Rogers is Captain. If you say Captain America, they know who you're talking about. If you say Steve Rogers, they have no clue who you're referencing, right? Even right now, with the character of like Isaiah Bradley in Captain America: Brave New World, people understand the concept of the character if they watched Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but they don't know the nature of the character because they probably never read Captain America: Red, White, and Black. And so they don't know that he was like an attempt to recreate Captain America that failed disastrously. And he was the last surviving member of his platoon, all of whom died from exposure, or I guess the grotesque nature of experimental super soldier serums. They don't know that kind of stuff, right? And that's the audience that we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about you and me and people like that who already have an affinity for comics and love to sit down and read them. But when you're talking digital, you literally like somebody goes onto dccomics.com or whatever their sub website is for comic books, right? And they just type in Batman and the response, new to Batman, start here. New 52, volume 1, new 52 volume 2, new 52 volume 3, so on and so forth. And then just read forward from there, right? Read DC Universe Rebirth #1 and then start Tom King's run. And like that's it, right? It's incredibly simple. If you walk into a comic book store, they're going to be like, okay, cool. So like, yeah, here's what you need to read. Here's a stack of 15 books that just weigh a whole lot, and you can carry it out to your car and take it home and read. Whereas digital, it's the psychological effect. It's just much easier to cope with. It's much easier to organize. It's much easier to structure.
I don't even think
And
it's just a psychological thing too, because I think the ease of immediate access is a thing too. Like you can link someone straight to it. Whereas if I go to a comic book shop and then I'm talking to the shop owner and he says, "Oh, you need to read Avengers Disassembled," but I'm out of stock of it.
yeah,
That immediacy is not there. So I can understand the immediacy of digital comics being better, and I think that's why things like Unlimited exist. That's why things like what's the DC one called?
Infinite.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, whatever. They still doing Titans, the TV show? Yeah, that the immediacy I think is better, and I think for new readers, and especially in the year 2024, that is there. But I also think there is a separate fan, and I'm not sure it's the same fan who does like the collection aspect of it. Like when you brought up the whole like organizing comics and stuff like that. In my mind, I would thought, oh, I prefer doing that physically. I prefer the tactile nature of it. But I also recognize the majority of people who listen to music don't collect vinyl.
Yeah.
So it's complicated for sure.
Oh,
But
I mean, you're 100% right. There's something about handing X-Men #1 from 1963 to Jim Lee and saying, like, will you autograph this? And like him and his wife and his friends are gathered around, like, are you sure you want to do this, man? Because it destroys the value. It's like, no, it makes it priceless to me. And then having Jim Lee sit down with me for like 15 minutes and give me like a trip down memory lane from when he first started reading the X-Men to when him and Will Spertaccio were roommates out in San Diego, and then like him getting into the comic book industry and all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, there's things about that you can't do digitally, right? Like, hey, can you take your finger and just, on my iPad, right? I mean, it's a whole different experience. But one of the things that I've learned in my time running Comics Explained for the last decade or so is there is a massive difference between people who love comics and want to get back into them, people who went to go see comic book movies and are curious about them, and people who have never seen a comic book movie and never read a comic book in their life. And somebody told them this character's cool, or they're just curious about Batman and they want to go read it. And that third group is the biggest group. That's the biggest number of people who are out there who have never seen a comic movie and never read a comic book, and for whatever reason that makes sense to nobody but them, they want to go read a Batman comic and get into Batman as a character for the first time. And digital makes that so much easier because you can catalog and you can organize with everything from, okay, like, are you curious about Batman? All right, read this comic here. Right, read like this one-shot comic, right, with Batman. And if you dig it, then here's everything else. If you really want to get into Batman as a character, then here's where you actually start if you want to become a more serious reader. You can kind of do that in comic book stores, but again, right, to Tyler's point, it's psychological, right? Like, do you want to walk out of a comic book store holding 15 trade paperbacks, or do you want to have a tablet in your hand reading them at your leisure? And I think for 99% of people out there, they want to be reading it on a tablet because they can read it on the bus. They can read it when they wake up in the morning. They can read it before they go to sleep. It's just convenient, infinitely more convenient. And I think it's more important for the comic book industry to market to that audience as opposed to marketing to what you and I, all in the entertainment industry, refer to as the vocal minority, the smallest number of people.
But in the case of, and we really do need to wrap up this conversation.
I feel like this could go on for like hours.
Yeah, good. It's good.
You're absolutely right about that, and we've spoken about this for hours already, and none of our minds have changed.
No, we need
but
to, like, you're at Midtown, right? Like, you're in New York.
yeah,
Dude, we need to like meet up at like New York Comic Con or something like that, man, and like sit down and have this conversation.
it's so funny, dude, because I have seen you at New York Comic Con multiple times, but I just, was like, oh, that's Rob. So hopefully this year we can actually,
Well,
meet.
this year I won't be able to make it, but like next year.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I was hoping to get a picture with you and Sal together. But yeah, I feel like you can already do that. You can already be a person who wants to consume digitally and jump in that way. But in this industry, in the industry of comics, I'm pretty sure what I'm about to say is an indisputable fact. The majority of people, not the vocal minority, but the majority of people read comics one way, and that is for the physical way. So it would be the flip. It would be the inverse of the percentage that you just gave. What'd you say? 90%? It would be 90% want to read physically and do, and 10% want to read digitally and do. And those are the numbers, those are the realities that the industry itself has to reckon with. So when your money's on the line and you have to choose between leaning in on 10% of the people you have, and then a shadowy, unknown amount of other people who might jump on board if you promote digital the way you promote physical, if you have to choose between that and the physical audience that's there, that's loyal, that shows up every week, some of these people are showing up twice a week, If you have to choose between those, I know where my bread is buttered, and I'm gonna eat that bread.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd rather just not ignore that entire other potential market in favor of a smaller guaranteed market. I mean, you can do both. That's why I say. I mean, I wouldn't say get rid of comic book stores entirely, right? We're never sending comics to comic book stores. I just think like, sure. I mean, you're 100% right. I can go on to Amazon right now and buy the issue of Batman or Absolute Power or Spider-Man or Venom War that just came out. But there's a difference between that and just signing up for whatever DC's digital version is, which no one knows the name of that, or Marvel Unlimited, and being able to read right now and read a variety of comics right now. The only reason why you have that buffer on Marvel Unlimited or whatever DC's is to spare the existence of local comic book stores. Right. That's the only reason that it's there. Right. Drop that, give people an option, and then we'll really see which one people want to go with. And I would bet you dollars to donuts, right? If Marvel Unlimited makes Venom more available the day of release, and DC, whatever theirs is, makes Absolute Power available the day of release, digital sales will outstrip local comic book stores quick, fast, and in a hurry. It'll happen like that. And that's when you know where your market is. Now, comic book stores will call foul, but hey, I don't know what to tell you, right? Like, markets change, adapt or die. Like, that's the way that it goes. So, yeah,
All right.
it's an unpopular opinion, man.
No, it's okay. And I love the debate because it's always, look, we started the show with a very big hot topic that had people on different positions, different sides. So I appreciate the conversation. And like you said, it's one that is massive and we could have for hours. And I appreciate your perspective, even though clearly we're on other sides of this thing. I appreciate that you have a different opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, me too. Yeah, this kind of stuff is fun.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we show up every Saturday at 10:15 a.m. Eastern to have these kinds of conversations. Rob, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I don't need to tell the people that are listening to me right now, Comics Explained is pretty much the godfather of what it is that we do on the comics YouTube space. Obviously, we have different kinds of channels, but when you're talking about who are the people that you aspire to, when you start off as a little old YouTuber with $1 and a dream, and you're looking up at the titans of this part of YouTube, Comics Explained is certainly at the tippy top of what success can look like. And I know, because of being on this side of things, how hard it is to do what you do to the success level that you do it at. So hats off to you. Anyone who somehow is not subscribed to Comics Explained, go do that. Go subscribe. Go be one of the 2 million plus who listen to that sweet voice every single day, every single video release. It's a joyous chorus. We're all a part of it. Go join that at Comics Explained on YouTube. Rob, we got to do this again sometime. Really, thank you for joining
100%.
us.
Dude, I'd love to come back. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. We'll talk about it. We'll talk.
Yeah, it was awesome talking to you guys. I appreciate it, man.
No, thank you.
Thanks for coming, dude.
Take
Appreciate
care.
it.
I'll catch you guys later.